Good morning. So good to see you all. And haven't we been blessed with music this morning? Just the sounds of those voices and singing along, and I'm so thankful. I think this will do. Am I okay here? You're all right? Okay. So this morning, the title of my message, we're going to be looking at chapters 4 and 5 from Daniel. And the title of my message is Only God is Sovereign. So I had to look up sovereign to make sure I spelled it right. And so I figured I would probably need to give a definition so we just are certain of what this word means. Because if only God is this, then we got to know what we're talking about. So sovereign, as defined by a Google search, is as an adjective, it can be a noun, but as an adjective, sovereign is possessing supreme or ultimate power. And I'm going to present to you today the reason that this fact, that only God is sovereign, is both challenging for us, it's going to challenge us, and it's also comforting to us. So when I was first given this passage, well, two passages, it's chapters 4 and 5 from Daniel, I thought, that's going to be too much. Maybe I should just pick one or the other. But as I read these stories, and as I sat with them, I kind of got in like getting in a hot tub, and I let the stories bubble up around me. Then I became aware that these stories together give us two perspectives of the same idea, two important lenses to look at power, the ways that we need to confront power, and the ways that power can lead to corruption. So we're going to look at these two stories. Buckle your seatbelts, because it's going to be fast, I hope, so that we can get through both. Last week, Paul took us through chapter 3, and we heard how Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were able to act boldly in the face of abuse of power gone bad, corruption. And I love how Paul pointed out that it wasn't because they were certain that God would save them from the fire that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had faith. That's not why they had faith. They weren't sure. They didn't know. What they did know was that God was able to save them. And that was enough. The ability of God to overturn the outcome of the king's decision while not necessarily removing the king himself or even changing his mind, that was the key to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's confidence and faithfulness. So this morning, we're going to look at the sovereignty of God, and more specifically, the fact that only God is sovereign and no one else. Only God can act without accountability. And only God has ultimate power. And this is because only God can do that without corruption. Because God is good. And it is God's goodness that gives him the ability and that makes him worthy of having ultimate power. Because the rest of us, even if we have a little bit of power, not even ultimate power, it can tend to corrupt us, and that's what we're going to look at. So we have two stories, and we're going to look at this idea from two perspectives. First, from an introspective lens. We'll consider the ways that we might have power and authority. We'll think about it. Even if you think you don't have power, you probably do in a certain area or other of your life. And we're going to ask the Spirit to let us see if there are ways that power has caused us to be unkind or unfaithful or corrupt. So a little bit of a hard one first. But then the good one. Secondly, we're going to consider the idea of accountability from the lens of those who are powerless. We'll think of ways that we feel powerless, and we'll ask God for a vision of hope to see our role through a lens of security and not powerlessness. And we'll ask for the confidence of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So we're going to begin with chapter 4, which is the story of Nebuchadnezzar. Again, Nebuchadnezzar was in the last few chapters, and he has another dream. And as seems to happen all through Daniel, these kings have these amazing dreams. I don't know. I don't dream like that. I dream about like Boston cream donuts or strange things like that. I dream I'm at work and I can't get anything done. But Nebuchadnezzar seems to have amazing dreams that mean something. So at the beginning of the chapter, he says, he's telling the people about this experience, and he says, I was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous. It's interesting. He was at home in his palace, and he was contented, and he was prosperous. It might point to a little of what the problem is going to be with Nebuchadnezzar. You know, when we are content in our state that is greater and better than all of those around us, and we're not maybe called to look at their suffering even a little bit, and we're content in our prosperity, maybe we're headed for needing a little bit of an adjustment. So, of course, as continues to happen in this book, Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and it scares him, and he calls in all the magicians and the astrologers and all of those folks that he would call on, and they can't interpret it, and then he remembers Daniel. You know, all through this book, Daniel seems to continuously be forgotten by the kings. He's already done these amazing things you'd think they would remember, but they don't. And I kind of wonder if Daniel being forgotten in almost every chapter of this book is pointing to us a little bit of a nod to the fact that this book is not actually about Daniel. This book, although it's named Daniel, is not about Daniel's faithfulness. The book of Daniel is about God's faithfulness. And so this little reminder, as Daniel is continuously forgotten, is a little reminder to us to remember that this book is about God's faithfulness, not Daniel's. So finally, Nebuchadnezzar remembers Daniel, and he calls him in, and he's telling Daniel about his dream. And he says he dreamed, as he's laying in his bed, he dreams of this enormous tree. And the branches of the tree reach up to the sky. And the trunk of the tree is so large, it's able to be seen by all corners of the earth. It's this huge and beautiful tree with beautiful leaves and abundant fruit. And it provides shade for the birds and food for all. And so this is how Nebuchadnezzar starts out telling Daniel about his dream. So we're going to break in at verse 4. I want to read to you the words from the Bible. And Nebuchadnezzar continues. He says, "In the visions I saw while lying in bed, I looked, and there before me was a holy one, a messenger, coming down from heaven. He called in a loud voice, 'Cut down the tree and trim off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it and the birds from under its branches. But let the stump and its roots, bound with iron and bronze, remain in the ground and in the grass of the field. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal, till 7 times pass by for him. The decision is announced by messengers. The holy ones declare the verdict so that all living may know that the Most High is sovereign over all the kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes and sets over them the lowliest of people." So Nebuchadnezzar tells Daniel his dream, and Daniel, he knows something is off, and he's worried. He does not want to give Nebuchadnezzar the interpretation. He starts out, "O king, if only this dream were meant for your enemies." It's very diplomatic of him. But then we'll break in at verse 22, Daniel's response to Nebuchadnezzar. He says, "Your Majesty, you are that tree. You have become great and strong. Your greatness has grown until it reaches the sky, and your dominion extends to the distant parts of the earth." And then Daniel goes on and he tells what's going to happen to Nebuchadnezzar, and it's everything that happened in the dream to the tree. And so Daniel says, you know, you're going to go through this for 7 seasons. You will be like an animal. And then Daniel leaves him with one piece of advice. He says, you know, God has given you this dream as a warning, but, you know, renounce your sins by doing what is right and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. And maybe this won't happen. That was Daniel's advice. It's interesting that Daniel instantly looks at and goes to Nebuchadnezzar's sins. Maybe he hasn't been doing what is right. And wickedness, he says, by being kind to the oppressed. Maybe Nebuchadnezzar has not had the oppressed on his radar at all. Or maybe he's the one oppressing them, most likely. And so Daniel says, look, just take care of the oppressed and do what is right, and maybe this won't happen. And it seems that Nebuchadnezzar forgot all about it, because it wasn't until 12 months later he's walking on his roof garden and he's thinking about how great he is and what a great king and what a great palace that he has. And verse 33 we'll read from. It says, "Immediately what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from people and ate grass like the ox. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High and honored and glorified him who lives forever." And then just jumping down to verse 37, he says, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble." So we can see in this story how God did humble Nebuchadnezzar. He told him at the beginning, he gave him a warning that he would humble him, but he did tell him that he would not cut him off. He left the stump in the ground. This was meant to be a humbling so that Nebuchadnezzar could return and then be a better king, be a better leader. And I think that this story fits well as an introspection, a way for us to look at, an opportunity for us to look at the ways that we have power, we have control or authority in our lives, and consider if we are carrying that well, or if there's something that the Spirit needs to reveal to us about the ways that we are carrying that power. And you might look around and say, I don't see Justin Trudeau in this room, or even Tim Houston, he's not here. No, I think you're all off the hook. No, we all have areas of our lives where we have power, we have control, we have, if you are a parent, you have an incredible amount of responsibility for the power, for the control, and the authority that you carry as a parent. If you are a coworker, there can be ways that you have authority or control, even if it's not official. Maybe you're the person who makes sure that the microwave gets used at the proper amounts of time, and you control that microwave in your workplace. These are silly examples, but if you just think for a minute, you will think of some ways, some areas where you carry authority, responsibility. And I think that it's important that we consider these things regularly, because power actually does corrupt. Power corrupts us because we're not God. And the thing that power can do to us is it can make us blind to the ways. This is the most important thing, I think. Power makes us blind to the ways that we are sacrificing love for the sake of something else, usually something good. We will sacrifice love for the sake of justice, or for the sake of holiness, or for the sake of faithfulness. If you think for a minute, you can consider, I'm sure you know a story of times when you could see someone else doing that. You say, I am going to be that parent, I'm going to be such a strong parent, and my kids, they're not going to do that in my house. And all of a sudden, without realizing what we've done, over time, we've had to distance ourselves from compassion or love in order to uphold morality for our children, or holiness. These are good things: holiness, justice, morality, faithfulness, very good things. But if we look at the New Testament, if we look at what Jesus says about love, what the man asked him, what are the greatest commandments? The first two greatest commandments are love God, love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus said those are the greatest commandments. So love is the greatest. And Paul said, faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. Why do we insist on throwing love out the window the second we are holding on to justice? And we think, oh, I have power, I have control, I'm going to make sure justice is served here. I'm going to make sure that we are all holy. That's important. And Jesus says, no, but love is more important. And only Jesus shows us how to hold those side by side. Jesus doesn't sacrifice justice or holiness for the sake of love, but he certainly never sacrifices love for the sake of those others. And if we call ourselves Christians and we follow Christ, then that is our role. That is our role model to follow, to really make sure that we hold on to love. We don't lay it down so that we can uphold these other things. I want to just jump into a passage in the New Testament in Matthew where Jesus himself talks about how to be a good leader. So if you find yourself in a role of leadership or authority in any tiny capacity of your life, you can look at these verses. So they're from Matthew 20, verses 25 to 28. I'm going to read it from the Message. Jesus says, he said, "You've observed how godless rulers throw their weight around, how quickly a little power goes to their heads. It's not going to be that way with you. Whoever wants to be great must become a servant. Whoever wants to be first among you must be your slave. That is what the Son of Man has done. He came to serve, not be served, and then to give away his life in exchange for the many who are held hostage." Jesus gave us the perfect example of how we can hold on to love and justice together. And the only way to do that is to serve, is to become a servant. If we try to hold on to love and justice together without becoming a servant, without recognizing the worthiness of all of the humans around us, without setting ourselves above somehow, if we try to do that, then we usually fail. But Jesus tells us how to do it. We have to be the servant. So that was the quick run over of the first story, and I hope that it just gave you an opportunity to look introspectively and maybe be challenged by the Holy Spirit in the ways that you have control or power over others, and ask the Holy Spirit to reveal to you how to change and how to do it better and how to do it without setting aside love. The second part of this message is the second story from chapter 5, and in this story we're going to look at what it feels like to be powerless, to be the one who is under the power of a corrupt ruler. And I think that you will relate to this really well. The story is a little jarring. It's actually a lot like a spooky ghost story that you might tell around a campfire, but it's in the Bible, so we're going to read it. And this story is about Belshazzar. So we'll just break in right away at verse 1 of chapter 5. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles and his wives and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. You know, once again, just in other chapters, all the magicians and astrologers were called to interpret the writing that was on the wall. And the king was so afraid, and no one was able to interpret it. But finally, Belshazzar's wife remembered Daniel. Oh yeah, remember that guy? And they call in Daniel, and they show him the writing on the wall. They tell him what happened. And Daniel's response, we're going to read starting at verse 18. This is Daniel's response. He says, "Your Majesty, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and peoples of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted put to death, he put to death, and those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted, and those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like an ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and sets over them anyone he wishes. But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines, drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. And this was Daniel's, speech to the king in front of everyone. And then Daniel gives his interpretation. And, the words that were written, Daniel says, they mean your days are numbered. Your life has been weighed in the balances, and you've been found wanting. And your kingdom is going to be divided, and it will end. And verses 30 and 31 tell us that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over his kingdom at the age of 62. And this, I'd hear this story preached on when I was a kid. It was always used with a little bit of fear tactics to make us afraid. What if you died tonight? Where would your soul be? And try and scare us into the kingdom a little bit, I think. And it's a scary story, you're just sitting around, drinking, having a good time at a party, and then this disembodied hand comes in and starts writing on the wall. And it's like a ghost story. But I think that this story is best looked at from the lens of the powerless, because here is this king, this wicked king Belshazzar, and even in history you can read about him. He seemed to be a usurper. He seemed to be kind of a wicked. He was actually a regent, and those who were under his control. Sure, the Israelites who were in captivity, they were under his control, but even his own people and all of the people of the kingdoms around, he was just ruthless and greedy. And here he is getting his just desserts. It's like, yeah, we get to watch this, but that's not how God works. God never tells me about someone else getting punished for their actions. I don't get to sit by and watch that. And you say, well, that's what this story is. Okay, well then this story is about something else. It's about something other than that, because that's not how God works. God doesn't tell me how you're getting held accountable. God tells me how I'm getting held accountable. So why? I read this story and I thought on it for weeks, and I did some research. I read about the history of Babylon, and I was just curious, why is this story here? Because that's not how God works. It's not so that we can sit back and say, well, we have the good God. We're the good ones. We're the Christians, so this guy is getting punished for not following the right God. That's not what this story is. So what is it about? And it hit me because I felt, ever since probably my whole lifetimes, but since COVID started, haven't we all felt a little bit powerless? We're all powerless to circumstances like pandemics or hurricanes or things like that. And so this heightened awareness of our powerlessness to circumstances has made us a little bit fearful of our powerlessness to people or to people groups. Because ever since COVID, when we started feeling powerless to the circumstances, I've become more aware that people are really hating feeling powerless to systems or to people, to leaders, to groups. And there's a lot of different ways that we can feel powerless. So I might feel powerless, maybe the political party that I want gets voted in, and I'm like, yes. But then the other party blocks them from making the changes that I want them to make. And then I'm like, I feel powerless, even though my political party is in power. Or maybe the opposite political party gets voted into power, and then I'm just like, look, if all of the people who voted for them would just disappear off the earth, we'd have a better earth, wouldn't we? And that's when I know I'm on the wrong track, because that's not how God works. So what do I do with this feeling of feeling powerless? We've seen a rise since the pandemic in things like conspiracy theories. Maybe Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and Bill Gates, they're all together in on something, and they're all making off like bandits, and the rest of us are suffering. Or, you name it, there is a conspiracy theory out there to make you feel like you can explain how you feel powerless. And these kinds of theories, we can all come to different conclusions about why we feel powerless. And in fact, probably in this room, there's as many theories as there are people. I have an idea of, that's why I'm feeling powerless. It's their fault. And you're meanwhile pointing over at this guy over here, and it can cause divisions within families, within communities, because we can say, well, I don't agree with you. That's not why we feel powerless. But you know what we can agree on? We all feel powerless, and it's not a good feeling. In fact, that feeling is terrifying. And so as I read this story and asked God, why is this story here? Eventually, I felt God saying, I want you to know that you're not powerless. I want you to know that how you're feeling, and you feel like, I've got to do something about this. I got to just get out there and make sure that that other side that are supporting that political party, I got to make sure that they are completely decimated and nobody listens to them so that things will go my way. Or, I got to make sure I uncover this conspiracy theory so the rest of the world can understand and see what I see. And God's like, look, you're not powerless. Did you ever have that experience? I can't be the only one. If you're driving in a snowstorm, but you're not driving, you're actually in the passenger seat, and the person that's driving is navigating that snowy roads and icy roads very well. But you're sitting there and you are keeping your eyes on the road. And all of a sudden you realize, I actually, for the last, 50 kilometers, have believed that if I took my eyes off the road, we would go off the road. I've had this experience, and I kind of wake up from it and go, I can distract myself or something. Here I am sitting in all this anxiety and fear, and it's literally doing nothing. I'm not the one driving. I have no power to keep that car on the road. No matter how well I watch that ditch and make sure I did not mentally allow the car to go there, I have no power. And it's like God is saying, you're not driving. This universe bus that we're all on, God's driving it. We are not. We are in the passenger seat. And we can sit there and hold on to all of our fears and our anxieties, and we can start pointing fingers at each other and saying, oh, that group of people over there, they're the reason that we feel powerless. But truly, we are powerless in lots of ways, but we are not powerless in the ultimate way because God is driving. And no matter what I do, even if I slam my foot down on the on the front of the car, as I sometimes do if I want my husband to stop a little faster than he does, I might slam my foot down. It does nothing. It doesn't stop the car any quicker, actually. And so all of this anxiety and this fear and this fighting that we're doing and all of these divisions among us about who is making us feel powerless, in the end, they don't matter. Because God is sovereign. And we see in this story that Belshazzar was held accountable for his actions. It might have taken too long. There might have been people who died under his rule who never got to see it. But the truth is that the story of the universe is long. And we don't have to solve it, and we don't have to carry the burden of it. And so I hear in this story God saying, it's okay. You can just take care of the things that are right around you. If you are in the position of being a whistleblower and telling about evil that is happening right in front of you, do that. But if you're not, you can just rest. You can just take care of those in your immediate circle. This is permission from God to feel like you can just look after those who are in front of you. And as I read this story again and again, I got thinking about a psalm, and I'm going to end with this. I'm just going to read 2 verses from the beginning of the psalm and 2 verses from the end of the psalm. That it really spoke to me when I was young, because sometimes doesn't it feel like the wicked just get away with everything? The evil ones do evil, and they prosper, and they have this and that, and they get everything they want. And those of us who are just trying to live humbly and genuinely and care for our neighbors and do the right thing, that we're just getting thrown thing after thing that just wipes us out over and over again, and it just feels so unfair. And I would come to this psalm, and God would comfort me. And it's Psalm 73. I'll just read 4 verses, and then I'm done. But as for me, my feet had almost slipped, for I had nearly lost my foothold, for I envied the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. That's the beginning of the psalm, and the psalmist goes into, all of the ways that he sees the wicked prospering and receiving blessing after blessing, and it just seems unfair, and he feels so powerless. But at the end, the psalm goes full circle, and he comes to the conclusion that God is sovereign and that he doesn't need to worry about it. He doesn't need to worry about the punishment of the wicked. And he comes to the end and he says, "Whom have I in heaven but you? And earth has nothing I desire besides you. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever." And nothing can take that away from us. Amen.